Hello and happy Monday, everybody. I hope everyone had a great weekend. Welcome back to Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech on the Vietnam War. Today, we're going to be finishing reading this speech and answering those last few questions on page 166. So before you watch this video, you should have already read through pages 158 to 164 in your ebook, picking up where we left off on Friday and finishing the speech. If you haven't done that, go ahead and pause this video while you read. I want you to read the speech on your own first before we go through it. So now, diving right in, the first thing that I want to point out is on page 158 in this first paragraph. So for the first half of this speech, King has been presenting his reasons for speaking out against the war, and he presented them in a particular order. His last reason being his concern for our troops. He says, "I am as deeply concerned about our own troops there as anything else." Why would he have this be the last reason he presents? Probably because he knows his audience will be more receptive and sympathetic to this part of his argument. This is a generalization, but for the most part, Americans have always been sympathetic towards our troops. And this is the part of King's argument that he knew would hit his audience. If they didn't relate to how this war has affected those who are poor or people of color, specifically men of color being drafted and deployed, if they weren't convinced by King offering the Viet Cong's perspective, then they would most likely be touched by the idea that our troops are in danger. This final argument leads to King's ultimate conclusion that America needs to stop its war against the Vietnamese immediately. He says that down here. "I speak as one who loves America to the leaders of our nation. The great initiative in this war is ours. The initiative to stop it must be ours." Then at the bottom of the page 158 and onto page 159, we see King quote the great Buddhist leaders of Vietnam. The quote reads, "Each day the war goes on, the hatred increases in the heart of the Vietnamese and in the hearts of those of humanitarian instinct. The Americans are forcing even their friends into becoming their enemies. It is curious that the Americans who calculate so carefully on the possibilities of military victory do not realize that in the process they are incurring deep psychological and political defeat. The image of America will never again be the image of revolution, freedom, and democracy, but the image of violence and militarism." By using this quote, King appeals to authority. He's using an authoritative source, the Buddhist leaders of Vietnam, to validate what he's been saying in his entire speech. The use of this quote also has the effect of making listeners see their country from a new perspective, because the quote shows how negatively America's actions are viewed by members of the international community. Moving on to this next page, on page 159, we see King transitioning to a new structure. Now that he's listed his reasons and built up to his conclusion that America needs to remove themselves from the war in Vietnam, King uses the rest of his speech to elaborate on that conclusion, which becomes support for his second argument. In the middle of the page, we see King offer 5 concrete steps for the United States to take. These steps show that King has thought about how his conclusion that the war must end can be implemented on a practical level, which strengthens his argument. He's not just presenting his audience with a problem, he's also offering them a solution. Question number 5 on page 166 is going to ask you about these 5 steps that King presents on this page. So make sure you reread this section carefully when you're answering that question. Moving on to page 160, it starts at the bottom of page 159 and then goes on to page 160. King makes a recommendation to young men being drafted in the war. He says, "As we counsel young men concerning military service, we must clarify for them our nation's role in Vietnam and challenge them with the alternative of conscientious objection." He asks them to be conscientious objectors, which we see in this footnote means refusing to participate in military actions because of moral or religious beliefs. Remember that during the Civil Rights Movement, King called on his people to protest peacefully and non-violently, conducting sit-ins and marches rather than destroying property or attacking people. But he also asked them to refuse to obey laws that were racially unjust. He asked them to be conscientious objectors. Question number 6 asks you to compare these two things. Something to consider also is how influential Dr. King was at the time that he gave this speech and how controversial it would be for him to advise young men to undermine the official policy on Vietnam. This speech wasn't just King offering his opinion, it was him calling the people to action. In this next portion of the speech, King begins building his next argument. Look at lines 372 to 373. What is the new argument that King is presenting? He says, "We will be marching for these and a dozen other names and attending rallies without end unless there is a significant and profound change in American life and policy." How does this new argument he's presenting relate to the one he's already made? Question number 7 on page 166 is going to ask you what conclusion King reaches through inductive reasoning and whether or not that conclusion follows logically from the evidence he presented. This is the part of the speech that question is referring to. They want to know what argument he's making here and if he offers enough reasoning to support it. At the bottom of this page, we see King making an appeal again by quoting the late John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated only 4 years before this speech was made. What appeal is King using? What is he appealing to? And what is the intended effect on his audience? Why would he choose this quote, and why specifically from John F. Kennedy? On the next page, we see him appealing to his audience's sense of ethics, their desire to do what is right. One of the ways he does this is by alluding to the Good Samaritan, a biblical story most people are familiar with. If you're not familiar with the story, you can open up this footnote here, and that will tell you a little bit of information, or you can Google the Good Samaritan story. It's very easy to find. He uses this story to illustrate his argument, saying not only that we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but also that we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. Down here, we also see King return to repetition. Remember that repetition calls the audience's attention to something. What is King calling his audience's attention to by repeating the phrase, "This is not just"? On page 162 and 163, we want to again pay attention to a couple examples of connotation. Remember, connotation is a feeling or idea that a word invokes. On page 162, King says, "It is a sad fact that because of comfort, complacency, a morbid fear of communism, and our proneness to adjust to injustice, the Western nations that initiated so much of the revolutionary spirit of the modern world have now become the arch anti-revolutionaries." King uses the term arch anti-revolutionaries to suggest that Western nations have come to oppose world justice. They have become afraid of change and are unable to see beyond their own perspectives or imagine how to foster the spirit of democratic revolution. Think about the word choice here. Instead of just saying they have now become against revolution, he says they are arch anti-revolutionaries. It's a much more intense way to phrase that thought. And then on the next page, King uses the word bosh to describe the more common meaning of love. He says, "I'm not speaking of that force which is just emotional bosh." Bosh connotes nonsense or a waste of time. The use of this word conveys that King is impatient with people's dilution of the meaning of love. The love King refers to is a force which all great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. The key that unlocks the door which leads to ultimate reality. The kind of love King is referring to is the kind of love that brings us together and creates change. On page 164, the last page, as King brings his speech to a close, he uses two different rhetorical devices, rhetorical questions and parallelism. Where do you see these devices on this page, and why do you think King would use them here? What do you think he'd want to be doing with the end of his speech? What effect would he want to have on his audience in his closing remarks? Question 8 is going to ask you to also look at some word choice and the connotation of those words in lines 513 to 539. So make sure you read that section carefully and think about what connotation King's words have and why. When rereading this section, be thinking about whether or not King ends his speech effectively. And remember that his argument being effective doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree with him, just that he has presented an argument and provided evidence to back up that argument. Now that we're done with King's speech, you're going to be returning to page 166 to answer questions 5 through 8. You're going to be doing it in the ebook just like you did last week, so you'll be clicking on this box with the Q and typing your answers into here, just like you did before. As always, let me know if you have any questions. And otherwise, I will see you all again online on Wednesday.